Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's another episode of Information Revolution, which is a podcast about information and how we work with it. It's about the current state and how things are changing in our industry, and also thinking about what might need to change. So I'm Michael Upton. I'm a director of Metataxis New Zealand, based in Wellington, and my focus is on digital information management.
Hi, and I'm Judi Vernau. I'm also a director of Metataxis, also in grey Wellington today, and I'm an information architect.
Great, and my name's Karl Melrose. I lead business development and consulting for Leadership Through Data, an information management training company, and I'm based in Adelaide in Australia.
Fantastic. Alrighty. So I thought we'd start today with just a couple of very quick stories. Everyone loves a little anecdote. So one of them is about a records team working in an organization who got some software, and that software helped them to categorize all of their information, classify it, and determine how long they needed to retain it for. And management saw that retention and disposal or disposition was basically off the table. It's done and dusted. And so they didn't renew some contracts and they let some people go, because they didn't see that that team was doing much else. The second scenario, had a conversation with a CIO who'd just come out into a government agency. He didn't really understand what I was doing, classic thing with information management. And he said that he'd been around his team and the people who reported to him looking for basically efficiencies, and it's code word for cost cutting. And he talked to the records person there and said, "What do you do?" And that person said, "Well, I'm responsible for ensuring that we comply with the Public Records Act 2005. And that CIO said to me, "That guy's first against the wall," basically. He saw this guy as being about compliance and thought, well, who cares? So I thought a really interesting topic, and it's kind of flowing from what we were talking about last time, thinking about what you can do with a stock take, what you might do with sort of the outputs of, working on information architecture, is what would you do in a information and records context if retention and disposal was off the table? So if you had sorted out retention and you didn't need to think about that anymore, what else is your job about? Like, what else is it that you do? So
I was going to say, we were saying in the last one that, I was saying about information flowing all the way through the organization and how it's what we do in government organizations, and lots of other ones, as you pointed out, most other ones, in fact. But the retention and disposal is, what do we keep? What do we get rid of? But then how do we find it while we've got it? I mean, that's all part of working with it and using it and so on. How do we find it, and how well are your people finding what they need? That would be the big thing for me. What kind of issues do they have? What is it that they can't do that they want to do? What can't they find? Why can't they find it? How do they actually want to find it? I would be spending quite a bit of my time finding out the answers to those questions so I could work out how to improve it in the here and now. That's my 4 pennyworth on that.
At the RIMPA conference this year, I gave a presentation that the thinking really came out of starting to address this question. I called it Recovering the Strategic Power of Records Management, which is, I thought was a pretty brave title for a records conference. I'm actually repeating that for the IRMS as well in a couple of weeks, which will be interesting to see if it plays differently for, a group that's primarily in the UK versus an Australian group. But the underlying thesis of that for me was that I feel like the first story you told, I did some work for that agency when I was with Information Proficiency, my previous employer, and they had completely equated records management with management of retention and disposition. And I feel like that is the case in lots of agencies. Lots of agencies, particularly as they've moved off paper. I mean, if you've still got a lot of paper to manage, then people kind of get the records team, that they deal with the paper. But other than that, it's kind of, they manage this system and they deal with retention and disposition. But I mean, if I look at history, I feel like that's a detour that we've taken because of the archival institutions. We've got these archival institutions that have been created, and they regulate, they capture 0.001% of all of the information created by public servants. That's all they're actually interested in, but they regulate all of it. And I feel like if I look at the history of these sorts of things, people created records so that they could be organised and know what they were going to do. If you were a government, 1,000 years ago, you basically needed two things to be effective. You needed an army and you needed records. And it was, the army allowed you to exert your strategic power and your strategic influence, but the thing that actually allowed you to be organised about how you did it was records. So, if you wanted to make sure that you had paid your army correctly so that they didn't turn around and go, oh, you haven't paid us, so now we're going to come back in that castle we just took and gave to you, we're going to take it back and we're going to give it to someone else. But that kind of thing was, it was actually records that let you do all of that. So, I mean, records was really how government were organised. And I think that we've lost that connection and we've become obsessed with some things that the archival institutions want us to do, which get us away from the core purpose of records, which is really to make sure that, it's all the classic stuff that we talk about in some ways. It's, how to make sure that people have the right information in the right place at the right time, the right level of quality. But I think we've become poor at communicating how quality is tied to the results of the organisations that we work with. And that's what I'd spend all of my time on. If retention was off the table, I would spend all of my time going to parts of the organisation and saying, right, as you said in the last podcast, Judi, the government, which is where I do most of my work, they're basically information processing businesses. That's pretty much what they exist to do. There's permits and there's approvals and authorizations and there's funding grants, but it's generally taking some information, applying some rules to it and some discretion and saying, right, now money goes here, you are authorized to do this because of the power under this act. It's all of those kinds of things. So where are we having poor results in those processes, and how do we connect the quality of the information we're getting to it? And the way I talk about that, I use the DICAR model, which is straight out of the information management body of knowledge. It's data, information, knowledge, actions, and results. And it's simply your results, you get your results through taking action. So the quality of your action influences the quality of your results. Knowledge, which is really a decision-making function, deciding what actions to take, influences which actions you take, and your information impacts on the quality of your ability to use your knowledge, which is the ability to take action and your ability to achieve results. And I'd spend all of my time talking to parts of the organisation about that and helping them say, right, how do we specify the information so that, you get the right balance of cost and quality in your process. And, if you've specified your information this way, said this is the spec for this process, well, if you want to, and I know I'm talking too much at the moment, but one agency that I didn't end up doing some work with, but I did quite a bit of discovery work with a couple of years ago. They had their repository in one place, the records team in another place, and the team that was actually doing the processing work in another place. Now, if they wanted to get those records back to the people who were actually doing the process, the round trip by the time it went I think I've talked about this before, went from this off-site repository to the records team to unpack the box to send just the file they needed up to this processing team, 4 days and $150. So, you can sit there and you can say, we have the way our information is specified at the moment, and, we may not have sat down and deliberately specified it that way, but that's the emergent specification, means we can't do anything in this process for less than $150 in less than 4 days. So if you want to do things like offer service over the phone in real time, well, we need to change the specification of that information.
Yeah.
And that's like those are really meaningful things. If you're dealing with, some kind of claims management for health, if somebody has to wait a week for you to approve a claim, I mean, people can die in a week.
Of course,
they can die waiting for that kind of thing to happen. That's an extreme case, but you could die. You could have a critical surgery delayed, all because of a function of the quality of your information. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that's what I would spend my time on. I'd spend all of it on the quality of the information and how that impacted the results, and all the projects we could do around that to specify the information, improve the specification, improve the results of the organisation. Or you know what, we might even find that we've overspent on a process and that the results we're getting are better than we need. So you know what, we can stop paying for this business system and still have an appropriate level of quality.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Michael, I'm going to stop talking for a while and throw over to you now.
Absolutely fine. It's really good stuff. And I mean, I would really mostly just echo that kind of thing. I suppose I'd note that when we have been talking in previous episodes, we really haven't talked about retention very much. We really haven't talked about how, for instance, doing a stock take and then deciding what you want to do with that, how that relates to retention. I mean, obviously requirements might come up in the course of a stock take, but a lot of it is about quality, and a lot of it's about thinking about processes and improving processes, but understanding what kind of information, specification or quality, or what are the characteristics of the information that would allow you to do your processes well, basically, and do your job, do your business well. So for me, I guess, the main thing I would be looking to do if I wasn't, if I didn't have to talk about retention, is actually just really focusing on the here and now. Like, that's the key thing I'd be saying, is actually looking for those really short-term problems that are hitting the workers right now, and seeing how that then translates into those outcomes that we were talking about last time, those real-world outcomes related to basically trying to deliver a service in government. So for me, that's part of something, it's a phrase that we've definitely all talked about before. I'm not sure in this podcast so far, but the idea of establishing a virtuous cycle. So the kind of reverse of a vicious circle, the idea that basically by doing good that your internal customers see, then, you're establishing this kind of, basically increased goodwill with your internal customers. They're thinking, oh yeah, I like talking to those folks, and they sort my stuff out. They help me, and they help. They don't wave a stick, or I think a lot of records people understand that there's no great love in discussing compliance with people, but it's a question of like, what else should I be doing? And for me, it's like, well, how can I help that person with their job today, and sort of try and shift that focus away from thinking long term. Like, I think in the background in our work, that always ought to be there, and there's really, really important reasons why that needs to be there. But in terms of my interactions with people and my conversations with people, I'm thinking about, well, what is it that I can do that's actually a current business problem, and that I can fix it by helping them to basically change how information is being managed in their area.
I love that you said that. I
Thank
feel
you, Karl.
like that. But no, I think that long-term thinking piece. I talk to so many people who just, they love to think about they've come up through an archival study, kind of track or something like that, and they love the historical value piece of it, and they really believe in that. But how do you get to it? And I think I think you just nailed it. I mean, I think you get to it by focusing on the short term and the here and now. Yeah.
And why I wanted to introduce that story at the start about the CIO saying, oh, well, I'm going to let this guy go because he's talking about compliance, is because, you kind of build up your little reservoir of anecdotes from around the traps. And I've never heard someone say, I explained to my management about the value of compliance, and then I got more resources, or, you know, then my job got better. You know, and sure, there might be some exception. I'd love to hear from people if you're listening to this and you're like, yeah, compliance really works in my area. But I think even if it did work, I'd be nervous you're putting yourself in that kind of model of funding that's based around risk, and you know, model of funding where you're like, cool, we'll plug gaps until we're happy with compliance, and then we'll let you go. You know, which is really dangerous way of working. Whereas if you are in a position where it's like, oh, that team over there, they're cranking and we love them, and you know, the conversation around sort of funding and resourcing ought to, if not disappear, but you know, you basically ought to have more stability in your work. Like, no one goes, oh, we'll let go of the finance team. Oh, maybe they do these days, but they shouldn't. They shouldn't. I was just thinking about automation and how people get overexcited about the idea we'll just automate everything and people can leave. But anyway, I
mean, so compliance is a cost you minimize. Compliance is a cost you minimize, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, you know, I mean, if you want to create that virtuous cycle that you're talking about, you don't create it through compliance, because you know, compliance has a really nice, you know, generally has a really nice bar of, okay, now we're done.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, you may never quite get there, but you know, done enough gets done a lot in a lot of organisations. The irony of actually this conversation in some ways is that I feel like I've been trying to talk to people about focusing away from compliance for the entire time I've been working with government. At exactly the same time, when I'm also talking to, but when you put when you suggested the topic for this podcast, I had a chat to a friend of mine at a bank and was just talking to her about what we were doing, and she was saying, oh, look, you know, in government, maybe, but you know, in the bank where I am at the moment, I mean, compliance is actually that's why we're here. You know, we've got a compliance issue, and you know, she was saying that.
It's a different kind of compliance, isn't it?
Sorry, no, but it is retention-focused compliance. They're actually having regulators come and whack them for keeping things too long.
Excellent.
Which is, I know, that's exactly what I was completely surprised. But
amazing.
I also, I mean, I guess that is what, if you look at privacy legislation.
Yeah, I
think that's
about to say that, yeah.
Well, I'll shut up then, Judi, because you've probably got a much smarter point of view on it than I do.
I was just thinking compliance relating to less financial information. But of course, if you're talking in the banking sector, then that's very important. But yeah, personal information, that's also very high profile. You know, the whole GDPR stuff in Europe, and, you know, firms are getting fined huge amounts of money. So in that way, compliance is a big thing in that respect. But when you think about the Public Records Act in New Zealand and people not complying with it, it's not quite the same thing, really.
They won't turn up and enforce it. So, you know, I mean, no bank in Australia laughs at AusTrack anymore. You know, AusTrack is the Australian Transaction Reporting and Analysis Centre, I think. Basically, it's the counterterrorism financing and anti-money laundering regulator here.
So they're the regulator.
They are the and you know, one of the things that they do is, you know, if you've got transactions on, if you're a bank and you've got transactions on an ATM that are $10,000 or over, you need to report that to AusTrack. And I don't know the specifics of it, but there are a couple of banks here that they fined. You know, they fined one $785 million for not reporting, which, you know, those are records. You know, you didn't provide the records that you should have.
Yep.
You know, they fined one bank $785 million, and they fined another one, I think it was $300 and something million. And, you know, I mean, nobody is saying to those regulators, we're not going to comply with your stuff.
No doubt.
No.
But
exactly.
I guess, I mean, the thing I'd really want to emphasize is that I don't, you know, I see the value in compliance. I mean, you know, I understand why certain legislation is in place around records and so forth, and I think I'd never sort of try and put people off caring about that stuff. Like I do find that stuff really important. I just think that whether you want to say tactically, strategically, whatever, that in terms of our profession and actually creating these virtuous cycles and actually establishing relationships and trust and so on and so on. Like, I don't think you can lead with compliance, or it has to always, there always has to be an and, So, so if we wind it all the way back around to what you first said, Judi, about like findability being something that you would be focused on. I mean, normally compliance in the record space will certainly have an aspect of access, the idea of access to your records. But maybe this is tying things together with what Karl said about quality and so on. You're not, you're not specifying from a kind of day-to-day sort of business and operational angle what access might mean, and you're certainly not focused normally on your own sort of staff requirements. If you're just talking compliance, access is much more about providing the information if asked, and making sure it's in a nice format, but in a very, very vague way, and it really is that flavor of sort of just enough to make sure that you can tick it off, rather than going, right, well, in this specific circumstance we need to be able to find the information this way in order to be able to turn the service around, and in a certain time frame or within a certain context, like for instance from home, like those kinds of things. Or just whatever the geographic location, that might be one of the specifications that has to be able to be done from anywhere. And then that level of quality, I mean, it sounds stupid, but it clearly delivers more value than just saying, yes, we've met some compliance benchmark, because you're able to say, we've considered the outcome of this and determined that what we need in order to get the outcome we want, looks like this and has these certain criteria. So, yeah.
I think things like official information act requests are things that are quite good examples of the need for all of those things that we've all just said, the findability, the quality, the how much time is it, the whole process. And just at the kind of lowest...
FOI in Australia, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, or, well, actually, it's not just FOI, it's GIPA in New South Wales, and it's something else. It's RTI in Queensland, and it's...
Wow.
But getting information out of government.
I was just thinking that from the process point of view, I've seen so many different ways of handling them. Just recording, it's come in, you record it, you deal with it, hopefully, and then you record that you've done it. Lots of different ways of doing that, some of which just take stupid amounts of time and are very inefficient. So that's one kind of information flow. But then you've got all the other people who probably need to be involved in finding the information that's going to answer that request, and how inefficient those processes can be. Can they find it? How easy is it to find the stuff that you need in order to comply with that request? So there's compliance in there, there's the time that's spent, lots and lots of time. If you want to be able to make that faster, more efficient, then you really need to think about all of those aspects about your processes and findability. And that's, you could save so much time and effort and give the public a better outcome. So it's kind of a little example that sums up so many things, and quality too, of course. What is the quality of that response? It kind of sums up so many things that can go horribly wrong.
For sure. And another thing that I really like about that example is that it's something that most any kind of a government department or agency or authority has to do.
Yeah, so exactly.
It's a standard.
Exactly.
It ought to be a standard process in that sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the problem with it though too is that I think that I see the value in talking about GIPA, RTI, FOI, whatever we're calling it. I think the challenge with that process though is that the scope is really wide, and so I think trying to develop findability for that process, it can. I think that's an interesting process, but I mean, it's not routine. If you know what I mean. FOI requests are not a routine thing.
Sure.
Getting the request there's a routine there, but then what you go and do after that, where you look. I mean, do you feel like I don't feel like if you had to specify the inputs and outputs for that process, it would be an extremely wide specification.
Right.
And
That's
because yeah, you ordinarily would have kind of one bit of the organization that does the overall management, and they then normally have to go and engage with relevant business areas, and then those business areas do different things based on basically the structure of their records and information.
They do, but they're all working within one domain, as it were. They're working within one set of subject matter. So it ought to be possible to put findability tools in place that will help that. I mean, obviously, sometimes with an FOI, you're trying to find this piece of information, this statistic, and sometimes you're just going, I need to know everything that you guys know about this. And those are very different searches, if you like, ways of trying to find stuff. But you need to have the tools in place that support that.
I mean, it's almost a good barometer process, isn't it? Because if your FOI requests come into your agency and they're dealt with really quickly, then you can probably sit back and say our information must be extremely findable.
Yeah, fair,
that's terrible terminology.
Yes.
Easy to find. Yeah.
Easy to find.
I think we're well and truly at time.
Okay.
And as much as I would love to continue this conversation, I think in the interest of keeping everybody awake, we should we should wrap up.
Nice.
So,
hey, well, I'd like to wrap up by just
please.
saying we got some lovely feedback from someone who said that she's just quite new in her profession and that she really enjoyed hearing about the connection between information architecture and information management, to the extent that she felt that there should be more about that if you're actually getting, studying that stuff academically. So I thought, that's really nice. It's really great to hear that. So if anyone else has any feedback, but including things that you'd like to hear about or things that we haven't done, then love to hear from you. Likewise, we're always looking for guests, so we're gonna feed that into the format down the track. So please sing out if you're interested.
Cool. Thanks,
And
Michael.
that's us. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Judi.
See you next time.
See ya.
Bye.